to the podcast. Wonderful to have you as our
so
guest.
Much.
Can you say your name again?
My name is Isya Burkhardt-Bedeau.
Wonderful to meet you. And you're from Deakin?
Yes, correct.
Yes.
I'm a PhD researcher here at Deakin.
Okay. Can you tell me about your PhD project?
Certainly. So my principal investigator and supervisor is Dr. Tebece Molla, and he is an Ethiopian heritage researcher studying the engagement of school engagement of African heritage students with refugee experience. And so I'll be studying under him in a larger 4-year ARC-funded project where I'll be doing my own specific research.
And the students that you are studying, they are students of Deakin or?
No, they are students from across Australia in every state. And I'll be looking at the educational services of community services, the assessment, and the curriculum, and how it's relevant and supports this particular cohort of students.
Okay. So what is typical for those students? What types of study topics do they choose?
Well, there's the standard Australian curriculum, and my understanding is that this is often purchased. The materials for the curriculum is purchased from private organizations who design and create this content, and then it's up to the teachers to deliver the content and their own pedagogical method for delivering the educational experience to the students.
Oh, yes. And what is the age range of the students?
Well, this will be K to 12
okay.
for this particular research, which is within my PhD in education.
Yeah, okay. That's very interesting. And do you have any results yet?
It's just beginning.
Yeah.
We do know a few things, but we have to be tentative because nothing can be yet confirmed. And we're yet to do a lot of the field work, gathering the data, because ethics clearance comes after my colloquium, and I've only just started the PhD research. But in my capacity as a technical philosopher at my education startup Genius Tools, I have more data I can share about pedagogy, hortagogy, and some of the things relating to teaching students and their learning experiences.
Okay. I would love to hear some tentative results, if you can share.
Well, I suppose I can get into some details about what I do in my capacity as a technical philosopher at Genius Tools. And it basically all started with myself trying to figure out how to learn better and faster and more profoundly, and also to be more engaged and enjoy learning. And I went down into the rabbit hole of accelerated learning. That's a key word there. And accelerated learning was interesting at the time. It was kind of a 90s phenomenon where they proposed that you would listen to Baroque music and that somehow would entrain the brain while you were studying to better learn and to retain more information and potentially even learn faster. What I found was that I could actually listen to anything that didn't have a voice in it, or anything that didn't accompany a specific range of frequencies that were used for language decoding. As long as it didn't go into that area, I could basically listen to anything and it would enhance my learning experience. And so I started to I guess, use that in my own teaching, especially later in higher education where I taught at RMIT University in the School of Design. And the idea there was to help the students study and do excellent work. And every trick we could use about whether it's accelerated learning or enhancing engagement by using novelty. That could be virtual reality, using augmented reality. Anything that was novel or new could often engage the student in such a way that it was disruptive to what their usual routines were, but interesting enough that it would greatly enhance the engagement with the learning material because of the novelty.
Wow, that's amazing. Something that caught my ear now was this that you said about the frequencies. So what do you mean when you say that the music doesn't go to those frequencies? Do you mean that the melody doesn't go to those frequencies, or do you use some kind of...
Yeah, absolutely. As a hobby, I should mention, I do produce music, especially electronic music. And I set a world record in that area, creating 130 songs in a year. So I did 13 albums of live music using drum machines and synthesizers. So there is some in-depth understanding there about sound and frequency. And what I can tell you, and this is just purely anecdotal evidence, I'm sure there is some aspects of it which I can validate scientifically, and I'll mention where I do, and then other times I'll say that it's anecdotal. But my experience was that we do understand that the brain has specific circuitry for decoding and encoding language, and the voice, the human voice, occupies generally a frequency range. What I noticed is, and often will find, that it's very hard to concentrate on certain things that require using similar or adjacent or neighboring neurological networks when we are dealing with language. So, for example, if you try to read a journal, a scientific journal, while at the same time listening to someone singing a love song, it's very hard to concentrate. If you remove the lyrics of that person singing a love song, and you're not engaging the language decoding networks of the brain while trying to use them to read, it seems to not clash and free up the brain to be able to read while listening to the music. And sometimes it seems that the music, because of a steady beat, can actually entrain the brain to keep a pace and almost rhythmically kind of push you through the reading. So it seems like, from what I understand in my own experience, that the listening to music that is instrumental music, that doesn't have lead sounds or sounds which take the attention, and with a very strong melody that's within the vocal range, as long as it doesn't do that, it seems to be able to enhance the learning experience by complementing it.
Yeah. And for sure also the tempo of the music has a meaning there.
Absolutely. If it's too fast, it can be overwhelming. If it's too slow, also it can be overwhelming. Generally, I've found that a pace slightly faster than walking pace. So 110 BPM is the average walking pace. If it's around there or a little higher, it seems to be a comfortable pace from what I've seen for listening to music with a steady beat and being able to engage the brain in learning.
Yeah, because if it's too slow, it's actually trying to put your mood down and even your vigilance.
Potentially, yes. Yeah. And I have noticed, however, that this is not the case, for example, with the frequency of the voice of the speaker, for example. The neuroscientist Huberman, Professor Huberman, discusses that if someone has a very high-pitched voice, the frequency is often difficult to entrain a mood from a high-frequency voice, whereas a low-frequency voice, the mood can be entrained by the brain because it's slow enough. Okay. So the engagement can be higher with a low-frequency voice than with a high-frequency voice. And that perhaps has implications for podcasts or for audio learning and anything that is auditory.
Yeah, of course. It makes me think also about the origins of listening to voices, namely fetal period, listening to the mother's voice, and from a little bit more distant direction also the other family members' voices. So there could be little kids who are the siblings, or there could be other adult voices and so on. But all of those are far more distant than the voice of the mother.
Yes.
And then very soon after the baby is born, so then their ears are open for all kinds of voices.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of makes sense that a person would have an affinity to the deeper voices because it is so comforting. You can imagine being in the womb, the sound would be very muffled. So all of the high frequencies would be rolled off and filtered down, and you'd be getting a lot of deep resonances from the voices, whether it's the father close by with the mother or speaking directly to her belly, to the baby, or the mother speaking herself from within her voice is resonating. So the sound would, you can imagine, be very warm, muffled, and low frequency. Yeah. So it makes sense that it would be very comforting.
So that's our auditory home.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when the baby is born, the sound shape completely becomes very different.
Yes.
You start having these very high-pitched, squeaky sounds from your environment. It must be a similar experience as when you are exposed to the visual world for the first time. Everything is way too bright and the baby is trying to hold the eyes closed because it doesn't want the light to enter the eyes.
Yes.
But you can't actually close your ears.
Yeah.
So that must be a kind of a chase-making experience for all of us in our childhood.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And it really explains why we value auditory information, and it overrides many of our other senses. We know that the eyes are kind of hardwired to the brain, but shortly close to that is our perception through sound is so powerful.
Yeah, exactly. I'm also thinking about the correlation of higher and lower pitch, using those in your daily life. If you think about the fetus listening to the mother, so sometimes the mother is probably speaking with a little bit higher voice, maybe she's a bit tense, or there's a difficult situation or something like that. And then sometimes she's speaking with a very low voice, compared to her own voice range.
Yes.
And that would mean that she's very relaxed and very happy and probably not doing anything so important at the time, maybe just, enjoying herself or whatever. So could this correlation also be somehow relevant to the fetus?
Absolutely. I would say that we would have to do some research on that for sure. And I would excuse my ignorance in advance if there already is. I'm sure there's a great deal of data about that. We can imagine that setting the appropriate environment for learning with the atmosphere of the room and the space and the sounds in that space would have a dramatic effect on our learning, our retaining of memories and information, and perhaps even our cognitive abilities. So I would imagine that creating as relaxed an environment as possible, whether it's having soft music that's not in the vocal range, and low and soft noises, calmness, it seems sensible that would enhance learning.
Yeah, and also soft materials. At least in Finland, we have this problem that we want to make schools very clean, and we want to make them easy to clean and avoid any allergies and anything like that. So what it results in is very little textiles, very little soft materials, and then what you are going to have is these high-pitched echoes in the rooms, and so it's not a good thing. You could then have like acoustics on the ceiling or something like that to help the situation, but it's also a visual thing. When you see big soft fluffy things, you already kind of know how they sound like and how they make the environment sound like.
Absolutely. Yeah, you make a good point. This the issue with tactility and learning, I would say that these also are considered novelties, especially when we go into the domain of more experimental and more creative types of tactile surfaces. And it's critical, especially in the age 1 to 5 for child neurological development, to experience as much tactile and textural engagement and contact with materials and objects as possible. And that in the environment, the learning environment, is critical. And I think that is lost on adult learning as well. We seem to think, we've gotten through our childhood. We don't need to touch stuff anymore because we've elevated to the lofty intellectual domain. But this intellectual domain is so well enhanced by enhancing our environment with these materials, textures. We know that a book and holding a book and reading the book, we engage more and retain more of the information than if we're staring at a screen. So we have that data. So the virtual has a place, but the physical is still here. And until we're floating around in circuits and networks and no longer physical beings, we're going to still be tied to that. And so I think being cognizant, especially where you mentioned Finland, that not having enough, perhaps, acoustic treatment, having more plants and organic life within the learning environments. These are all natural environments for us. So to be in a boxed room with no natural light or no plants and no acoustic treatment, it becomes very cavernous and cave-like. And of course that would probably be quite distressing over time, especially if you've got highly fluorescent lights in the rooms and no fresh air coming in.
So my final question is, where can we hear your music?
The music you'll find on Spotify and the various streaming providers.
With your name?
It's under the name Mechagen, and Mechagen stands for machine generation, because I was generating all the sounds from hardware machines, synthesizers, and drum machines.
Okay.
So that can be found at MECHAGEN if you type that into any of the platforms. And
Wonderful.
if you're interested in my research, you'll find that at genius.tools. So the website is genius.tools, not .com, just .tools.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for taking part in the podcast. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Minna.